Hi everyone, and welcome to tonight's session on project management. Tonight we're going to look at scope management, just an introductory session, just a brief one, and I'll introduce you to a few concepts that should help you through your career. All right, so if we let's see if we can get going. There's our overall plan for project management. Remember, we said that there's basically the 9 different knowledge areas of project management that we have to go through. So in the next couple of weeks, we'll go through each and every one of these individually. So for tonight's session, we are just briefly going to look at the introductory session on scope. And specifically, we're going to talk about scope planning, what's entailed in scope planning, scope definition. We're going to look at scope definition as well, and also we're going to look at work breakdown structures. So what basically a work breakdown structure is all about is just breaking down the work into smaller pieces. Aaron, how's it going?
Good. Joshua, how are you? Sorry I'm late.
No problem. No, that's not at all. You know, these sessions are informal, so any time is a good time.
Yeah, just a bit of trouble logging on.
How's it going at work? You guys busy at the moment?
Oh, I am, yeah. Just trying to get these houses out of the ground.
That's always an issue. And what about the assignments? Have you got many assignments due now?
I'm just about on top of my assignments now. I got one for my materials 1 subject due on the 30th, I think.
Okay.
Just working my way through it.
All right. Good. So that must be what's the workbook?
Nah, that third assessment 3 on the steel product.
Oh, okay. All right.
I did the workbook like every week as I went through my studies, so that was pretty easy.
Yeah, that makes it easier if you if you manage to do that. You know, it does make it a lot easier.
Well, I think that one wasn't too hard, the workbook, but I enrolled in Benjamin Parker's cost planning subject.
All right.
And I'm only in obviously my first year, and that was a more advanced subject, so I had to spend a lot of extra time on that subject.
Oh yes, all right. And Ben, was he able to help you with that course?
Yeah, he helped me out a lot.
All right. Yeah, he's quite a new guy, and you know he's just gone through the process himself, so he knows exactly what you guys are going through, and you know what the assignments entail and everything like that.
Yeah, no, I had a lot of time for Ben. He helped me out a lot.
Mm-hmm. He's going to what courses are you doing in term 2 this year?
Oh, off the top of my head, only the 2 that were noted on the study plan.
Oh, okay.
The course outline, I think it's yeah, I'm not sure. It's on my mood.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. He's Ben's going to do construction planning, and he's going to do construction management too. So those are reasonably advanced courses. So you might catch him on the next go.
Yeah, I'm hoping because I live on the Sunshine Coast, I'm hoping I can get down to Brisbane and actually have a chat to him.
Oh yes, well he's in Brisbane, you know, so it's reasonably easy to get a hold of him, you know. And I'm coming down to Brisbane next weekend, so I'm meeting up with Ben on Friday.
Okay.
So, yeah, you should just make an appointment with him. I'm sure he'll be able to help you out.
Yeah, that was the plan.
All right, so you're the only guy that we've got tonight, so I'll just, this is going to be a quick session. We've only got about 30 or so slides. I always say it's a quick session, and it turns out to be a long session. But what we want to do is basically look at scope management, and I'll just give you a little bit of an intro there. And as we go through this sort of this term or this course, we'll look at each one of these 9 different knowledge areas, and some of them will take more time and some of them will take less time. So tonight's just the first session. We're going to do 2 sessions for scope because it's just too much to do into one evening. So at any point, if you have any questions, just go for it. All right.
Yeah.
All right, so what we'll do is we'll go through scope planning, definition, WVS elements and stuff like that, and we'll also finish, we'll have a look at change control. So if we think about the process, now in the first 3 sessions we've spoken about the different people, that's the stakeholders, and the stakeholders, they obviously have an influence into how our project goes. So and each of these guys are going to have an input into how our project is going to flow. So the first thing that we need is obviously a business charter, and the business charter is going to come from our employer or the client, because it's his project at the end of the day. So that's an L, and he's going to give us the authority to move forward with the project. So that business charter says this is what we want to achieve. We want to make a new type of product, or we want to achieve some kind of benefit for our company. Right, and from that, obviously, we're going to develop our project charter, and a project charter is a subset of the business charter. So if you think about an organizational structure, and there's our organizational structure, you might have a business charter sitting over there, but you might have various project charters sitting underneath like that. So it might be that there might be a few project charters that's responsible for that. All right, so I'm not sure exactly why my screen went away. It might be because I'm clicking the wrong button here. But in any case, so there we go. The project charter subset of the business charter. If we look at the framing report, just looking at the word framing, it means that we basically have to put a fence around our project. So our project sits in the middle, and we want to see if we can get a framing around it. So it's sort of to see if we can fence it off and make sure that we can contain our project within the parameters of the scope. So in order for us to get a framing report, obviously we first have to have a framing meeting, and at the framing meeting we're going to have our project manager. He's going to be there. We might even have the supervisor, the client, or the employer. He might be in there, and then of course all the other stakeholders might sit in there. And these guys are going to see if they can get our framing going and make sure that we cover most of the things. Now obviously the problem with these projects is early on we don't have all the information available, and therefore we are going to make mistakes. So we try and do it as thorough as possible to get the benefit out of it. The aim from this whole process over here, if we look at the process on this side, the aim of this process is of course to see if we can everything from that side, see if we can inject into our scope statement and see if we can get it as accurate as possible. Now that's not always it's not always feasible for us to try and do that, but that's what we're going to try. So the scope statement is basically just a short statement telling us what we want to achieve from our project. So there's not going to be detailed specifications or drawings or plans or anything like that. That only comes later. So if we dissect our scope statement, you'll see that we get the scope of works. Now, in many types of contract, you'll see that they either refer to a scope of work, or they might even refer to what we call a works information. So if you hear the words works information is typically the document that's handed out to our contractor, and he then uses the works information to facilitate the project. And we'll talk about those when we get to procurement management again, the different ways of talking about scope and works information. The scope of work, obviously, we need to break it down into smaller pieces. So once again, we're going to break it down into our work breakdown elements. The reason why we do this is to see if we can make it easier on ourselves, get somebody else to do the work, break it down into smaller pieces, eat the elephant. Remember what we said in the first couple of meetings, that eating the elephant makes it easier if we have it in small pieces. There's our project execution plan. Remember we spoke about that one last week, and that's going to tell us what's the methodology that we're going to use for each of these activities that we have. Something that's really important over there, and this is where we're going to talk about procurement in a following session, is the contracting strategy. All right, so depending on the type of project that we're going to go for, we might choose to go for an EPC or EPCM. And depending on what we want to achieve with our project, that's going to be the outcome. So we'll talk about those when we deal with our procurement session later on during this course. All right, so there's our process, or a typical process for how we develop the scope. And obviously, it doesn't always just fit onto one slide. And this whole process, if we think about the timeline that's involved in there, it can be many months before we get to the level of scope that we need to be. All right, so last week we introduced the stage gate approach to everyone, and this is just an example of a stage gate approach. So what we want to achieve there is basically, there you can see there's the different phases, and these are in some companies called tracks, but there's our gates. So these are the phases that we have over there, and there's our gates that we have to jump through. All right, so at each of those gates, there's a few criteria that we have to satisfy, and depending on how well organized the company is, the stage gate approach might have different levels. So for instance, the initial feasibility or idea generation phase might have different outcomes and different outputs that leads into the second phase. So what typically happens in a stage gate approach, we're not going to talk about this in too much detail, is all of these have to be satisfied, and we have to say yes, we're happy with them, and they roll over into the next phase. All right, and there we go. And the same now happens. This now becomes a little house building exercise or brick building exercise, where we say yes, we're happy with all of those, and we move over. And this is the process that we go through. Now, the idea behind a stage gate approach is obviously not to cheat. All right, so when you get to a point at one of the gates where you see, oh, okay, I'm actually not making the money that I'm supposed to make and the income isn't there, then the idea is that you do not move forward. All right, in that case, you have to say, all right, I'm not achieving the hurdle rate of this project, and therefore I cannot move forward. All right, so when we talk about project execution, we'll talk about the stage gate again, but this is a good example of what a stage gate looks like and what the key success factors are for each of the different phases that we want to achieve. All right, so now we can move on to project planning. And why do we do this? Obviously, we do it because we want to achieve something, so we need to make sure that we have these objectives. Now, for you guys as well, when you study at university, obviously you need some kind of goal, and typically the goal would be you want to achieve a degree at the end of the day, all right, or you want to make sure that you have a happy family, or that you make lots of money, something like that. And those are the objectives, so we plan for that. In order to get our planning correct, we use existing documentation or existing structured information that we have in the form of policies and procedures and programs. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. The wheel has already been invented, so we can use other projects to inform our processes to make sure that we don't do too much rework. So try and get as much information from the history books, from your body of knowledge, from your archives, anywhere like that, previous projects that you worked on, the project debriefing meetings, those types of sessions really have a lot of information. If we look at what the planning is all about, obviously we need it to be systematic. All right, so the easiest way to be systematic is to have little flow charts to say if this happens, and then make sure that you draw it out nicely so that it's nice and clear for everybody to follow. The idea behind a methodology like that is that when you get run over by a bus, the project can still continue, all right, in your absence, or if you decide to move on to another project or something like that. Now, key to any kind of project plan is, of course, that we have to be able to replan, because the only thing that's certain in terms of projects is, of course, the fact that we are going to have change. Right? So it's always going to be change. And the next point over there leads on to our continuous business improvement. Right? So it's always going to be a review and control. We're always going to submit it to somebody else, and they're always going to have a look at it and say, all right, this thing doesn't really work. What about if we add something in there, or if we change that wheel over there? How is that going to influence the execution of our project? Right, and then of course, one of the key aspects is we need to make sure that we know who does what and at what stage are they going to do it. So those relevant tasks and the associated responsibilities, of course, always important for us.
Hey Joshua, that CBI, that business improvement, is that usually undertaken by like senior people of the company? Like who normally looks after that?
All right, so typically continuous business process is handled by senior people, but it might even be through a consultant. So a consultant might be part of a project, and that consultant might be either from the client side, so either from our employer side or from our project management company side, right?
Yeah.
Depending on what type of project it is. But typically, this continuous business process, we used to call it the black hat process, where we would submit our plans to senior management and they would take it apart. And it's a lot the same with your assignments that you do for the university. You submit it, you think it's really, really good, and your lecturer takes it apart and says, what about this, what about that? And, you know, it's exactly the same process.
No.
And
yeah, that's what I thought. It was sort of like the experienced project managers that sort of help out and improve other companies' sort of work methods and stuff like that.
And you'll see, typically somebody that's been in project management for a while will move into consultancy. You know, it's sort of the natural progression. If you get to be about 55 or so, you don't want to run around on site anymore, but you've got a wealth of knowledge and you can share that with other people. You know, so that's something that most senior project managers you know, consider. And if you look at there's companies like Price Waterhouse and PIP, Partners in Performance, they typically do exactly that. You know, they look at the continuous business improvement of projects and facilities. You know, so yeah, interesting times. All right, so the reasons for planning, obviously, there's the big one, risk. All right, so it's all about risk and sort of trying to eliminate the risk. So if we can eliminate the risk from our project, that's the key thing that we want to achieve. Now, what do we do with the risk? We can either try and handle it ourselves or try and mitigate it by doing pre-planning, making sure our health and safety and all of those things are in order, or we can give it to the party that's best suited to handle it. So in terms of contract management, that would be the solution that you want to go for. You want to give it to somebody that's going to be able to handle that effectively. They're more geared in order to take risk. For instance, let's say you're in a big contract, you're developing a gas-to-liquid plant for Shell, and one of the risks is the changes in the law, for instance, the carbon tax. So would that be a risk that you want the contractor to take, or would you want the risk to be at the employer side? And in this case, changes in the law is always best suited to the employer because they can better adapt to the effect that these changes in the law is going to have. All right, other cases, for instance, inflation might be best suited to our contractor because they know how to adjust pricing to make sure that they allow for increases in prices. Another reason for planning is, of course, efficiency. All right, so we want to sort of either keep our inputs the same or even diminish our inputs, but make sure that we increase outputs. And then, of course, a better understanding of the objectives is always important for us to see if we can understand that better. All right, and the principle behind planning is, of course, that we can use it as a control mechanism. All right, so that first plan, let's call this, I'm just going to write here a baseline budget. All right, so there's our baseline budget. and the same with a baseline program. All right, so a baseline program, that is what we use to control. Right? We're always going to measure our performance against our project. So let's see if I can draw a little S-curve over here. There's our S-curve. Let's just wait for this machine to pick up speed. So there's our normal S-curve, and if we use that and say that's our baseline, let's say for instance we track our performance and we see that happening, we know obviously that we are running behind program. If we see this happening, we know that our contractor is ahead of schedule, or he might be front-end loading his budget. He might be exceeding his budget so that he can load it with cash. He's buying all the expensive parts up front, and we call that front-end loading. All right, so front-end loading is a principle that contractors use to get better cash flow, make sure that they maintain functionality throughout the project. All right, so if we look at our different project planning and control processes, I've just got a few items on there, and you'll see that this one typically becomes a loop. It's that continuous process that we spoke about. Obviously you can see that the management decision, that's where we start out. Then we define our goals and objectives, get our project definition in place. We start thinking about descriptions and instructions, high-level scope and work breakdown structures, and of course we're also going to start looking at how long it's going to take. All right, so remember, there's always time, cost and quality. Those are the three that's really important in any project, and it's always going to be so for us to try and balance those and make sure that we can get it together. All right, and then we can start from that point onwards. We can start moving into a little bit more detail. So we start looking at detailed planning on time and of course budgets. Those two go hand in hand, and we can do our time and performance calculations based on our current performance as opposed to our baseline information that we had in the previous steps. All right, and then we go all the way back again and we start the process from the start. All right, so that's just a few items that you can remember for your project planning and control processes. If we now start thinking about the types of planning for our organization, for our project, typically you'll see that I added in these strategic and tactical ideas just to give you a little bit of background. If you recall, when we did the session on organizational structures, I mentioned that it's quite difficult to change the organizational structure of a company or the culture of a company quickly. If we think about the government, for instance, it's going to take a long time for government to change direction. The same with organizations like universities. It takes typically a long time to change direction. An organization like the Australian Federal Police will typically take about 5 years in which to change that cultural direction. So there we go, the 5-year limit. There's our strategic ideas. And then of course tactical is less, so 1 to 5 years, that's basically what we want to achieve. Slightly longer term goal, and what we can think about is if we see ourselves, think about that type of vision. All right, so there's maybe 12 months over there, there's maybe 2 years over there, and there's maybe 5 years over there. And that's what we want to see, and the same with our projects and the same with our planning for the projects. If we think about budgets, the last three that I've got there is typically referring to financial aspects. So if we think about an operational budget, liquidity forecast would be up to 12 months. Cash management position is more immediate. It's going to tell you what's going to happen in the next 6 months. All right, so what type of expenditure are we going to have? How many subcontractors will we have to pay? What's been certified by our client? And of course, when are we going to get payment from our client? So those are the things that we have to think about. The strategic project variables, we've spoken about these previously, but just to recap a little bit, obviously we always have to keep the environmental analysis in mind. What is our competitors doing? Where are they moving? What's the complexity of our project? Is it a simple house that we're going to build, or is it going to be a plant that's going to be really difficult? All right, so I know you can't see that, but that's actually a nice factory, so I'll just add a little bit of smoke in there. So what's the difference between the complexity between a normal house and a factory producing some kind of a product for us, or might even be a power station? What's the strategic importance? How are we going to go through that? And what do we see over here? There's our life cycle phases again. This is also our stage gate approach. So our stage gate approach, once again, sits over there. Important for us to remember that that's going to be the phases that we're going to go through. What happens after our conceptual idea generation phase? Can we get through the feasibility phase, preliminary planning? When do we go out into tender? And when is the most expensive time on our project? Is it during execution, or is it going to be during our first planning phase? The stakeholders, obviously, who's going to be important for us? Our project manager, make sure that we have the right person for the right job over there. And then, of course, his support team that sits underneath. If we look at the factors that are going to support our roles over there, we need documentation and we need preparation and planning. So our scope of work, our works information, planning, our network plan, what do we want to achieve, where's our project going? All of those things we have to keep in mind when it comes to these types of projects. What's the preparation input going to be from our project manager? What about the management, senior management team and the different stakeholders? Remember, the stakeholders, there might be quite a few of these guys. There might be the unions might be in there, the government might be in there, the local community might be in there. We might have different role players, so subcontractors or even suppliers that sits over there, and they are going to be responsible for helping us to get through this project. So if we look at a simple definition of scope management, and what we want to see is we want to frame. All right, so remember, there's our project. Our project can effectively do that. So what we want to do is want to make sure that we do a frame around our project to sort of limit it and say, all right, this is what we've got. Our framing report says we cannot move outside of these parameters. If we allow it to do that, it's going to start costing money and it's going to start influencing the project in the longer term. All right, so always try and keep that in mind. Higher level scope, and we'll talk about the facilities just a little bit later. So if we look at a definition from the Project Management Institute, once again, they say it's subdividing. All right, so remember what we said, our work breakdown structure that sits over there, they are going to become really important, and we'll look at the work breakdown structure in one of the next slides. We also want to make sure that we estimate more accurately. All right, so how do we know that we're going to estimate more accurately? Is we're going to use smaller components. All right, so if we look at a house, let's say for instance there's a house, and I say, all right, what's the value of that house? You can take a guesstimate and say that's about a $400,000 house. But if we now start taking it apart and saying, all right, let's look at the different components, you are going to become much more accurate in your calculation of what goes into that house and how much it is. And you might find that it's only $360,000, or you might find that that initial estimate that we made was actually not accurate. This is really a luxurious house, and that we are closer to $500,000 or whatever. So you'll find that by breaking it down into smaller pieces. Work breakdown structure is really important for us, specifically when it comes to planning. It's basically one of the very, very first aspects of a project that we need to understand and do. If we look at the scope definition, it basically stands on two different legs. On the one side, we've got the scope of facilities, and the facilities obviously represents the physical and functional factors that's going to support our project. All right, so that's might be the hardware and the buildings and the facilities. That's going to be the end result from our project. If we look at the scope of services, the second leg, these are the work that's going to be produced, or the work that's required to produce the product facilities at the end of our project. So that's going to be our tools, the methodology that we're going to use, the standards, the specifications, and the procurement and strategy that we might involve in our project. And of course, we need to make sure that we satisfy the requirements of our scope and the standards. So if we look at all of this together and we follow into this, we can see that the scope of work uses both the facilities and the services, both of them at the same time. So it uses both of those to reach sort of a final point. Our project manager is obviously going to be responsible to get the team up onto scratch and make sure that it's communicated well, and our poor scope definition will obviously impact on our timeline. So if we think about the timeline, that's typically going to be impacted by poor definition. If we look at scope verification, why do we want to verify the scope and at what stage do we do it? We obviously have to do this progressively throughout our project. So continuously doing checks, continuously going back, making sure that we understand exactly what the client wants and needs, making sure that we understand what our engineering manager has come up with. And this is where our stage gate approach once again comes in really handy, because at each of those gates we're going to make sure that we do a scope verification exercise. Right, so we might also have PFDs or MFDs to help us through the process. I'm quite a visual person, so I like diagrams and photos and things like that, so that's always easier for us to understand. We might even do a few health and safety studies to see if that's if we're satisfying the requirements of the law or the requirements of our client, and then of course simple reviews of our plot plans. Right? So are we going to construct this project at the right location? Is it going to be suitable for what we want to achieve? And then of course we're going to finally, once the project is complete, do the inspections, the final inspections at the handover. All right, so there, if we look at our stage gate approach again, there you can see there's our different phases: the pre-feasibility, feasibility, and basic development. Now, in the pre-feasibility phase, this is where we start looking at the development of our scope. We are gaining insight into what our client wants to achieve. We're trying to get as much information in there as possible. We don't yet have anything to verify it against. Verification only starts in the next phase. So remember, over there, there's actually another gate. So there's gate number 2, sits over there. So it means that before we can jump the hurdle into the feasibility phase, we have to satisfy all the criteria for pre-feasibility, what that might be. Right, so it might be a high-level financial plan, a high-level constructability plan, something like that. As soon as we move into the feasibility phase, we can start the verification, and this is now where we go back to our baseline plans and try and see if we can verify what the scope or verify that the scope document that we've created so far is actually going to produce what we want to achieve. All right, and that process is continuous, so it keeps on going, and you'll see it moves into the next phase as well, into basic development. So as soon as we say yes, that verification is in principle okay, we can move ahead. If we start looking at the next level of scope definition, you'll see that this process is going on, and it moves into this phase over here, which is construction. All right, so this is typically the area where we start spending a lot of money physically being on site. And what you can see is that verification process is continuing into and well beyond construction phase. And that's because more and more information becomes available later and later on our project. Right, so there's an interesting fact to remember. It's not something that's just short and well. Right, so last week I introduced you guys to this slide. I just added it in there again to explain what we have. So early on in our project, we have a lot of opportunity for change. In the first instance, the opportunity for change is quite high. So over there, we don't have a lot of information available, but it's quite cheap to make changes. All right, so if we look at this red line over here, this one represents the cost that's associated with changes. And as the project moves on and on and on, you'll see that it gets more and more expensive. And sort of when we reach the end of stage gate 3 or stage gate 4, depending on how you look at it, basic development moving into detailed engineering, over there we can see that it gets really expensive for us to do any changes. And the reason for that is because we have to redo all of the work that we've done up to that point. Right, so all the work that we've done over there, in that phase over there, we need to now start looking at it again. We might have to redesign our air conditioning ducts. We might need to look at our interfaces again and see what the implication is, of course. And then, of course, it's just going to, as soon as we move into execution over there, it's just going to skyrocket and become really expensive. If we look at the elements of project scope management, we need to understand what's going to happen. What is it that we want to achieve? How are we going to achieve it? What's the specifications? What do we want to achieve? And how are we going to make it happen at the end of the day? What methodology are we going to follow? Are we going to get another contract in? Are we going to do it ourselves? Are we going to break it down into smaller pieces? That answers our next question over there. Break it into work breakdown structures. So if we break it down into work breakdown structures, it becomes a little bit more manageable for us, and we can say, all right, we're going to give somebody else a go, surround ourselves with contractors, with subcontractors that's already done this type of work, and we can trust them to execute this contract. Important, who's going to be responsible, who's going to be accountable. Remember last week we spoke about the difference between responsibility and accountability. Remember, the A sits on top of the R, so you cannot delegate accountability, but you can delegate responsibility. All right, important for us, obviously, who's going to be signing the checks at the end of the day, who's going to be our person that's going to approve any changes. All right, so our project manager, or is it going to be our client, who's going to make sure that our project stays on track in terms of changes to the scope. All right, so what is it that we want to achieve with our scope of work? We want a document or a specification that's going to give us the full picture. All right, so if we think about our employer, he sits over there. He knows he wants to get to that point over there, but it's not necessarily a straight line. Our employer will typically do this in order for him to get to his final goal. All right, so this is typically what happens on a project. We sort of know that we want this shiny new factory on the hill over there producing stuff, but we don't necessarily know how to get there. All right, and this is where we have our consultants, our EPCs and EPCMs. They typically fill in the gap over there to make sure that we have a complete and unambiguous document at the end of the day. We make sure that all the specifics are there. We make sure that it's a story that we can understand. The responsibilities are well defined. Who does what? What will the project manager provide? What will the client provide? What procedures do we have in terms of communication, contract administration? And how do we determine if something is to the right quality? And how do we make sure that we control that effectively? The support documentation that we have for the scope, and this might be different for each company. We might have questionnaires going around to try and get some information from the different role players. When I worked for a company called SAP, the software guys, questionnaires were one of the biggest sources of information for us, because that gave us information into the as-is, or the as-is scenario of our client's business. Right? So this is how it's currently being done. This is how we do it. And from that information, we were able to say, all right, we can now build a 2B scenario. All right, this is what we have. It looks a little bit like that, and we can create a nice square block based on the questions. That's just an example. We can also use specifications to guide us through it, so guidelines, and also previous projects. All right, so previous projects might also be a really good source of support documentation, because we don't need to make the same mistakes again. We can use the mistakes that we made previously and see if we can learn from those mistakes. The methodology for our scope of works, following on from our support documentation, who's going to look at it? Typically our engineering managers, they're going to look at it. They're going to see, all right, if we evaluate this, what value improvement processes can we go through? There might be contractors involved that might ask questions. So based on these questions, we might see that we designed something incorrectly, and therefore we need to look at it again. And this is why clarifications is really important. When we start talking about procurement, we're going to look at the procurement process and clarifications to contractors as well, because those have implications for our scope. Comments from the role players. Engineering managers plays a big role in this. Design, architects, quantity surveyors. Anybody can comment on the scope of work that's a part of that project. And then, of course, remember what we said, this is basically going to be a continuous process. So it's going to be continuously happening up until our project goes into execution, where we see that even after execution, it might still cause changes to the scope of work. Alright, so let me just put my phone on silent and move on. Alright, so our project specifications, what's different? Or why do we have project specifications? Is the project specifications the scope of work, or is it two different parts? And basically what we see is our scope of work sits over there. There's our scope of work, and there might be different parts to our scope of work. We might have guidelines, we might have specifications in there, we might have conditions as to the methodology that might be used, we might have drawings and schematics in there, and all of those components together will form our scope of work. So the scope of work isn't a separate document, it's basically a combination of different documents. So you might have different addendums to each of these or different sections to each of the scope of works. All right, so always remember that it's not a singular document, it's going to be a combination of different documents. Another factor that's going to go into our scope of work, we just go back over there, milestone schedules. All right, so there you can see it's going to become part of our scope of work. So we already have the project specifications sits over there. Now the next one is milestone schedules. All right, so that's also going to be a separate part of our document. It's going to give us clear indications of what our project is going to be in terms of time. When do we start? When do we finish? What's the sectional completion? Right, so if we look at our sectional completion, there's our little diagram, our Gantt chart. We might be able to hand over this part of our project to our client early, and they can start making money because they can commission this part of the project, and therefore sectional completion might be a good idea for us. All right, so the milestone schedules obviously a separate part. Another part to our scope of work breakdown structure. So what is a work breakdown structure? Basically, it's just a recipe. All right, so if we look at our project, it's breaking our project down into smaller pieces. So you've all seen these little diagrams, and this is typically all that a work breakdown structure is. It's just breaking down it into smaller pieces, and this small piece we can send to contractor A, and this small piece we're going to send to contractor B, and this piece we're going to give to contractor C, while the management over there is going to be managed by the employer, for instance, or our project manager, for that matter. You might choose to keep that in-house. All right, so depending on the type of strategy that we're going to have, we might have different ways of looking at work breakdown structures. All right, important for us to remember, the sum of the elements is going to be our total project, so that's always going to be there. And the easiest way to maybe understand that one is by looking at our next slide. And this one is just somewhere from Google. I can't remember where I got it. I got this about 3 or 4 years ago, but it still makes perfect sense and it really explains the principle really easy. So over there, you can see there's our total project. We're building a bicycle. So the first thing that we have is we have the full bicycle. So that gives us 100%. And each of the subsections of our bicycle now gets to be taken apart. And now you can see that we have wheels, we have a braking system, and we have a little bit of labor as well in there. There's our labor that sits over there that's going to handle that. But the most important components, frame, crank, wheels, brakes, and then each of those sections, again, can be broken down further into smaller sections. What you see typically is that these smaller sections will add up to the bigger sections. All right, so there's our crank that adds up there, and of course our wheels. There you go, and that fills up over there. And that's typically what a work breakdown structure is all about. It's breaking it down into smaller pieces. We might give this to contractor A, and we might give this to contractor B to handle for us or to manufacture for us. All right, it makes it a little bit easier. If we're happy with our contractor's performance, we might say that we're going to subcontract this out at an earlier level and see if we can get that going on. Just enter my password. My other PC has gone to sleep. All right, so there we go. So we might break down these pieces up front and see if we can shift it out. All right, so what's a work breakdown structure? It's just a way of looking at a project at lower level detail. All right, so that's all it is. It's just breaking it down into smaller pieces so that we can say, yes, we're going to eat that elephant, and this is why we broke it down, because we want to outsource some of those items. There's some of those items in there that we cannot do ourselves, so we'll get somebody else to look at it. If we look at another way of seeing the work breakdown structure, and this is the official way of looking at it, there's basically 6 levels, and you'll see some textbooks will start with 0 over there. I choose to start with 1. It's just easier, but some people, some textbooks will start with 0. Doesn't really matter. And the first 3 levels typically is managerial. So these 3 levels over there is typically at the managerial level. You can see there the first level basically, and I've given you a little bit of an example there. Let's say a total program would be the introduction of a new design Land Cruiser. All right, so a sub-project to the total program would be the engine, but there might also be the chassis and the interior that's going to be part of the sub-projects. So you can break it down already into smaller pieces. I just chose the engine as a good example so that now we can move on. And the next task underneath our engine might be mechanical, but it could also have another point which is electrical or even chemical. Let's say we're trying to build a super green Land Cruiser. We might go for some kind of chemical process or employ a chemical engineer to see if we can get it more environmentally friendly. We now break it down into smaller components, even the oil pump, the alternator, the camshaft, the crankshaft, all of those different components becomes sub-tasks. And now we can break it down even further into a lower level where we say we are going to see this as the design and testing of the pump. And what's the lowest level? The level of effort over there, typically this is where you see the guy pushing the wheelbarrow, or you see the guy sitting behind the desk drawing and effectively producing something. In a lot of instances, that level 5, the work package, would be the lowest level for procurement in terms of contract management. We typically won't go down into this much detail for a large construction project because it's just too much detail. Right. Typically, what we'll see is from about level 4, we'll start subcontracting the different tasks out. So if we look at a functional work breakdown structure, this is one that we did for a oil and gas company, for instance. This is an oil and gas example. There's our project. This might be the one that we did in Nigeria. So Nigeria EGPL might stand over there. That's our overall project. And now we can break it down into smaller pieces. And there you can see we go down into the different levels, our feasibility, pre-feasibility, all the way down to level 5, which is our work package level, where we say, all right, we are going to outsource each of these packages. We're going to give this to somebody else to do, or we're going to give it to a different department. And each of these guys are going to produce a document or a package for us, and that package is what we're going to work with at the end of the day. So our work breakdown structure is basically going to be the basis for our planning. And it's what we call a bottom-up design or bottom-up approach, where we take all the information from the bottom, we add it together, building that little house that becomes the total project. And to do that, we might use different tools to assist us. So our linear responsibility, these two charts is going to help us to say who's going to do which task. So effectively, the responsibility and accountability matrix and the linear responsibility chart, both of them do exactly the same, just different names. In some instances, it might be applied differently, but basically what these will do is it will give us a list of activities on this side, and it will give us a list of role players on that side in our matrix, and it will say this guy will do that, this guy will do this and this, while this guy might do this, and this guy might do that as well. In terms of our responsibility and accountability matrix, we might have letters. All right, so that means that person is accountable on that level, while if it's an I, it means that person must be informed. All right, so we'll talk about the RAMs and the LRCs again later on during this course. We're also going to look at our schedule, what we want to achieve. So there's our little Gantt chart. We're going to look at those. The cost estimates, very important for us. And of course, last week I showed you guys the graph that gives us, looks like that, and it gives us the rough order of magnitude, and semi-definitive and definitive estimates depending on which stage gates we've approached. All right, so the further along in our project we are, the more accurate we can become, right, the more information we have available. The same with our risk analysis. And we've spoken about the organizational structure for our projects. We have to make sure that we choose the right one for the right type of project, otherwise it will just fall over eventually. So basically, what it comes down to is that our work breakdown structure is key to all of our projects. It is going to have an influence definitely on our program because it's going to show us the different components that goes there, and it's going to give us the different times that we have. So what I'm trying to do there is draw a little clock. So there we go, that's the clock. We have to make sure that we look at those. It's also going to highlight the risk elements. Right, so what's the dangers? Right, so what's the dangers that we are going to face? What kind of organizational structure would be best suited to our project? By taking our project apart into smaller pieces, we can have a much more detailed financial estimate. Right, so we can easily see, all right, this is what we want to spend, and looking at our RAM, this is what we're going to say, who's responsible, who's going to be accountable, who's going to be involved or informed, and who's going to be contacted or asked for advice on that. And then, of course, integration will show us exactly how to fit everything back together again once we've broken it up. We've spoken about scope creep and scope growth, so I thought I would just give you guys a little bit of a definition for scope creep. All right, so this is typically unauthorized expenditure that we have on a project. So if we don't manage the scope well, if we don't verify it every now and again, make sure that it's well documented changes, scope creep might occur. And this one is the one that's going to cost our contractor a lot of money because it's unauthorized changes to the project, and typically it's not going to be paid for. If we look at scope growth or scope change, this one is valid and it's inevitable on any type of project. Right, so on any project you are going to have scope growth, just because at the beginning all the information is not available. In all the years that I've been involved in project management, I've not been involved in one single project where there's not been any kind of scope growth. Right, so it is inevitable, it will happen. If we think about scope changes and scope control, how do we do it and how is it influenced? Basically from our client side, from the employer side, and you'll see many times I'll refer to the client as the employer. It's just easier. I think that's my background from a contracting point of view. They might request a change, or there might be a compensation event that's going to be, or a change event, or a change request even that's going to be issued by our client. We might have to do an evaluation. They want to do an evaluation. Or there might be different reports or agreements that's going to change the way that we see the scope or affect the total scope at the end of our project. Now remember, the scope, once again, there's our timeline. It will change. Right, as our project progresses, more and more changes will occur, and we'll see that our project's value will obviously increase as time progresses. All right, so that's normal for our project. There's just another a few points that we can keep in mind when it comes to scope changes from our client or the user department. Approvals, really important to make sure that we have the correct procedures in place, the right documentation. Remember what we said last week, who signs what off, when do we get the compensation events effectively approved? Can our project manager do it, or is it actually our employer that has to sign off on those approvals? All right, so why do projects change? Many reasons for projects to change. What's the responses that we can have for these possible changes? Right, so we might investigate why our project is suddenly taking longer, or why are we spending more money on our project than what we first anticipated. We might have to do a risk assessment over there to determine what the impact is going to be on the overall project. And we might have to say, well, we are going to challenge the change. All right, Mr. Employer, why do you want to change this project? It's working fine. There's no need for us to change it. And if we find that we're not going to challenge it, we need money for it. All right, so we're going to ask for a variation from plan, or we are going to ask for a compensation event. All right, so we might even ask for money, because that's what contractors do. That's what our business is. We need money for these changes that we're going to effect for our employer. The potential deviation analysis, this is a long-term investigation into what the effect's going to be because of the change. We might negotiate the value of that change because it's going to stuff us around, and this is typically where the word buggeration, right, so this is the buggeration factor. All right, so the buggeration factor comes into play because our client is now just stuffing us around and messing on the project execution plan. All right, we can also think about doing a contingency. All right, so last week we spoke about what kind of values to allow for contingencies at what stages of the project. The plan might involve financial aspects, or it might include methodology changes. We can rely or recheck our specification, or we can just try and say, all right, we need this change because this was a bad design initially. Right, and then we start thinking about the rework that has to be done on a specific project. And then, of course, the last one over there, we just need to make sure we need the approvals from everybody. Otherwise, this will turn into scope creep instead of scope growth. All right, scope growth is a good one. Scope creep is the bad one. That's typically what we want. All right, so that brings us to the end of the first section on scope. And Aaron, have you got any questions for us there?
No, not for me. I'm good.
All right. All right, so there we go. It's a shorter shorter session this week. So next week we'll continue on scope. We'll do about 2 weeks looking at scope and making sure that we cover everything that we need to cover. And by doing that, we'll we'll get to all 9 of the different knowledge areas. If you have any questions in the meantime, just post them onto the Moodle site and we'll take it from there.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot, Joshua.
All right, I'll see you later.
See you.
Cheers, man. Bye.